Welcome back, Patriots, to our next screencast installment. So today's topic is going to be African American and women in the Civil War. And so they're kind of often overlooked groups as far as the Civil War and American history in general. So we're going to try and spend our screencast today focusing in on their contribution to the Civil War. Now we're going to do it through a very famous publication of the time called Harper's Weekly. And this publication was around before the Civil War, and it's going to be around after the Civil War. And they term themselves the Journal of Civilization, and it's a widely read and widely popular weekly newspaper within the United States. And they're famous for not only having articles, but also having some great illustrations that go along with it. So we're going to kind of flip through some very famous pages of Harper's Weekly to kind of capture some important moments in African American and women's participation in the war. So if you take a look at this front cover here, you're looking at a typical black unit during the Civil War and their white commander. So a couple things that you want to notice is number one, that they're going to have a white commander, and number two, that it's going to be segregated units. So we're going to kind of dive deeper into that discussion a little bit later in our screencast. So really where I want to start is kind of a little bit of a review of the Emancipation Proclamation. So we did a lot of this in class, but I just kind of want to reiterate it and kind of re-emphasize it because it is a very important topic as far as the Civil War is concerned. So what the Emancipation Proclamation stated was that all slaves within states that were in rebellion against the United States were basically hereby freed. Now, did that necessarily mean that all of the slaves in the Confederate States were really freed at the time? Technically, no, because the Confederacy is not just going to give up all of their slaves. So really what I want to kind of dive into and what we really analyzed in class, but I want to make sure that you get, is why did Lincoln issue this? If it doesn't really necessarily free the slaves in these states in rebellion, why was he making this statement? So there's lots of reasons for why. So what we're going to start with is disrupting the South's labor source. So slaves are going to do all of the real grunt work within the South. They're going to do all of the work on the plantations. They're going to do a lot of the behind-the-scenes work for the Confederate Army, although they don't fight in the Confederate Army. And so he's hoping maybe to kind of disrupt their labor source a little bit and kind of entice slaves to run away to the Union side, which they had been doing for quite some time before this, which was called stealing their freedom. So he's hoping to accelerate that a little bit and hurt the South's ability to make war and hurt their war machine. The second thing is he sees it as an opportunity to push his beliefs. So sometimes this is kind of overlooked by historians because, and us too in class, because we look at the practical stuff. But Lincoln really did have a free soil ideology, and he did believe in the abolition of slavery within the new territories in the West. And in a lot of cases, I think he believes that slavery is an overall negative and an overall problem within the Union. And so this isn't his opportunity. He has the chance now to do it, and so he takes the opportunity to do it. The third thing is to cripple the South's financial assets. And really what that means is that the South looks at the slaves as property, and therefore they are assets to Southern plantation owners. Now, if all of a sudden you take all of your assets, you take all of your property, and you devalue them, because Lincoln's devaluing them, he's making them human beings in the eyes of the law. What that does is it really destroys Southern plantation owners' physical assets that they have, and that's going to kind of hurt the Confederate banking system on a few different levels. The next thing is to gain some new recruits into the Army. So Lincoln is trying to hopefully entice some slaves to leave and to join the Army. But this idea is often given too much credit by historians in recent years. He does want African American recruits into the Army, but he's not relying on them entirely. African Americans are going to make up about 10% of the Union Army by the end of the war. So primarily it's fought using white citizens from the North. The last reason that we're going to discuss is one that's often overlooked, is to deter foreign aid to the Confederacy. So there is a link between the Confederacy and Britain through cotton. Britain's going to buy a lot of cotton from the South for their textile mills because Britain, the workshop of the world at the time, was creating or manufacturing a lot of clothing. And so there is a connection here. Now, with the war framed as to preserve the Union, Lincoln is not going to kind of excite Britain to stay out of the war or to help and aid the Union, because to the British, that doesn't register with them, preserving the Union. But if he can kind of change the aspect of the war and kind of make it more of a war about slavery, that might register more with England and maybe not make them help the Union, but definitely kind of deter them from helping the Confederacy. Because Britain by this time had outlawed slavery, they had made it illegal, and they did it strictly on moral grounds. So if Lincoln can paint the Confederacy as pro-slavery and in favor of this institution, it might really hurt their chance of getting any type of foreign aid. And increasingly, as the war continues, the Confederacy is looking for more and more help because they're slowly kind of deteriorating and they're having a lot of trouble financially and gaining enough soldiers to maintain this war that they've started. So those are kind of the many aspects of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so like I said, before the Emancipation Proclamation is made, a lot of slaves are going to do what's called stealing their freedom and running over to the Union lines when they hear that the Union Army is approaching and invading the South. Now, Lincoln kind of made this legal for the Union soldiers to accept them with the Confiscation Act of 1862. And really what that did was it turned slaves as contraband of war. And so it was acceptable for the Union soldiers to allow them to come over to their lines and to keep them, to grant them their freedom, and then eventually allow them to participate in the war and join the war effort for the North. All right, so if we take a look at this page of Harper's Weekly, we're going to kind of try and get a deeper look at African Americans and black recruits and black regiments within the Northern Army. So about 180,000 total soldiers, black soldiers, are going to join the Union war effort, which is, like I said, is about 10% of the total recruits or the total soldiers that fight in the war for the Union. This is a typical recruiting poster, a famous recruiting poster, and again, you want to notice the segregation of the units. It's an all-black unit with a white commander. So the most famous and the first all-black unit in the Civil War is the Massachusetts Volunteer Unit, the 54th Regiment. So if you take a look at the commander here, this was not a position that many white officers were willing to take for several reasons. So number one, although they're allowing free blacks to fight in the Civil War, it doesn't mean that there's no discrimination within the Union Army. The second thing is the way that they were labeled by Southerners. If a white commanding officer was caught as a prisoner of war fighting with an all-black unit, he was considered to be by the South an instigator of a slave rebellion, and he would automatically be hung and murdered for just leading these troops. Now, to kind of put this in context, yes, they're fighting in segregated units, but this was very common during the Civil War, not just for white units and black units, but by ethnicity, by culture, and very much by region. The Civil War Army is not made up the same way that our Army is made up today. It's not all integrated from different states like Texas, Louisiana, and New York, and people from all over the country fight in the same units today, the same regiments. Back then, you basically fought with your region. So you would fight with your state. So New York would have their own regiment, and Massachusetts would have their own regiments, and you fought with people from your neighborhood, from your city, from your state. And sometimes they would be broken down even by ethnicity. So this is probably the most famous Civil War unit of all, one of the most famous Civil War units of all time, is the 69th New York Regiment, which is known as the Irish Brigade. And they were often called the Fighting 69th or the Fighting Irish. And they were famous for their bravery in battle. They have one of the highest casualty rates in the entire Civil War. So a lot of people from this unit are going to die. But it was common to kind of break it up by ethnicity and by culture. Okay, so when they do join the military, what's going to allow them to do this, or part of what's going to allow them to get paid during this, is called the Militia Act of 1862. Now, it's going to give unequal pay to black and white soldiers. So the black soldiers are going to be receiving about $7 per month, and white soldiers, in contrast, will be receiving about $13 per month. So that's, from what I told you guys in class today, that's a pretty significant difference as far as what a dollar was actually worth to people at that time. Now, that's the way it starts, but eventually they're going to kind of fix the problem, and they're going to have equalization of pay. So by 1864, there's equalization of pay between white and black soldiers. All right, so now we're just going to kind of quickly take a look at women's role in the war. So the women's war effort, what did women do to kind of help the North? And we're going to specifically focus on the North and the Union women and what did they do to help the war effort. So their primary role as far as helping the war effort, you're going to see for the first time women really enter into the factories in large numbers. So about 100,000 women are going to get involved and work in the factories, sewing uniforms and helping to build products to make war against the Confederate Army. Now this is the first wide-scale example of something you're gonna see a pattern in American history of what happens during warfare. It was on a very small scale in the American Revolution. It gets a little bit bigger during the Civil War. World War I, it expands even greater, and World War II, it's on just a tremendous level. So what we're gonna call this, the wartime dichotomy of labor. And so what this really means is that men are gonna go off to fight in the war, and the women are going to kind of be left behind at the time. And when they're left behind, what that's going to do is it's going to kind of leave jobs available to women. And so women are going to take on traditional male roles. Working in factories is a traditional male role. And so you're going to see this in the Civil War. It's going to expand in World War I, and it's going to be tremendous in World War II. And so they're going to enter into some professions that were widely considered male professions before the war had broken out. So a great example of this is going to be nursing. Now in our society, we often think of nursing as a female-dominated profession. But before the Civil War, nursing was primarily a male profession, along with, of course, doctors as well. So women are going to kind of jump into this role and serve the Union cause by being nurses behind the scenes in battlefields and working with the physicians. Now, what you should know about the Civil War is that medicine and treating wounds was pretty horrific. A very significant amount of soldiers died from infection from their wounds, and with better technology and better medicine, they might have been saved. So the most famous female nurse at the time was a woman named Clara Barton. And she's going to kind of make a splash, and she's going to be famous on the scale of like Florence Nightingale, famous for her role as far as treating and saving people during the Civil War, soldiers during the Civil War. So that's kind of just briefly African Americans' roles and women's roles during the Civil War, and they both play, some pretty significant roles and kind of influence and help the Union cause. All right, guys, I'll see you guys tomorrow in class.